Hello and welcome. Today we're taking a look at late Cold War era AK74 style black polymer handguards. Now, I'm not talking about the WBP commercial productions. I'm not talking about the US made 922R versions. Those usually either have a stamp on the side or on the rear that indicates where it might have been made. No, instead what I'm talking about are these, which really don't have any particular maker stamp. There's a mold mark on some of them, but even still, it's not abundantly and immediately clear exactly which country they're from. And so if you were to pull one of these out of a random box of parts, it may not be as abundantly clear as it should be where exactly it came from. So that's what I wanted to talk about in this video. Instead, we're going to be talking about Russian, Bulgarian, and Polish, because while these three, especially from 20 feet away, I couldn't tell them apart. Even looking at them closely, I had to sort of hold each of them in my hands and figure out which one was which in order to develop a good system of identifying which ones are which. Quick and dirty, the Polish heat shield is super unique. It has some extensions here on the front. The Bulgarian palm swell is more than the others, and so the vertical lines sort of stab into it, which makes it a bit unique. And then the Russian ones, the most immediate thing from the outside is this extra little groove on the top that goes back a little bit further. For me, those are like the three singular details that I've been looking at to figure out which ones are which when I'm just have them kicking around. But looking at it in a bit more detail, we can talk about some of the differences. First off, looking at the front here, the Polish heat shield is super unique. Has a bunch of interesting stampings, and it actually sticks out past the front of the handguard to add tension, and that was carried forward through the various versions of the Tantal and actually to the barrel handguard here. That heat shield is the same, but here we have it in an AK74 style handguard, and so that makes it pretty distinctively Polish. While my particular Russian handguard lacked a heat shield, the Russian ones that are out there appear to be consistently quite shiny, whereas the Bulgarian heat shield is much less shiny and has a much rougher finish. Beyond that, from the very front, there's not a whole lot of difference, and moving back immediately we can see there's a difference in the way the front ribs are. So the Polish, for some reason, liked sweeping angles. So this front rib, it curves and it has a bit of a radius to it, as opposed to the Bulgarian, which is very angled and flat. So the Bulgarian is very much sharply angled from where this rib comes, and then it just is cut over straight. The Russian is also very similar in that it comes along and then it angles down straight. It does not curve, it actually just angles. So again, that is a very subtle difference, but it's one of those interesting contour differences that is decidedly different and unique to the Polish, whereas the Bulgarian and the Russian both are a bit more angled. Moving immediately back, we can start to look at the contours of how the palm swell interfaces with the rest of the grip itself. The Poles seem to split the difference in that it's fat, yes, but it sort of blends underneath the ribs. Whereas the Bulgarians, their palm swell almost on top of the ribs, and part of it is because the palm swell is a little bit thicker, but you can see it's very on top of the ribs and almost eating the bottom ones. On the Russian handguard, the palm swell just terminates here at the top. It's just flat. Moving back a little bit more, you can see the Russian one, these vertical ribs just, they almost taper into the palm swell, and the palm swell really doesn't stick out much beyond the ribs. The Bulgarian, with its much larger palm swell, just seems to consume these vertical ribs. They plunge into it and then they disappear. They don't taper at all. So if we take this Bulgarian and this Russian, we can see the difference here. So the Bulgarian, it just stabs into the palm swell, and the Russian, it tapers. Similarly, the Polish sort of splits the difference, and the handguard just exists beneath the vertical ribs. They kind of don't seem to interact too much. It tapers, but it's not as much as the Russian. So we can see on the Russian, it's a much more gradual taper, but the Poles sort of terminates. It's there, but it's not as sharp and sudden of a termination as the Bulgarian. So again, Bulgarian, Polish, you can see a much flatter, sharper termination, and then a bit more subtlety here. Moving back just a little bit more, we get to these vertical lines. Now, each of them do display the same style of vertical lines, and they have the same number of vertical lines. But again, the Russian has this very distinctive extra little bit that it sticks out, this top line. That does not always seem to be as prominent as it is on this particular handguard, but it does seem to be a prominent feature. The Bulgarian grip all terminate at exactly the same level. They don't have that extra bit, and it seems like it's a bit more messy than the Polish, which seems to be much more cleanly done, but also terminates in a very straight line. So another of the differences here between the Polish and the Bulgarian is the back of the palm swell. So again, the Bulgarian just sort of actually tapers almost before the palm swell itself and has inconsistencies in the depth of the ribs. Whereas with the Polish, the ribs are very consistent and they terminate into the palm swell nicely. Moving back just a little bit further, we have the very end of the side profile, and with that we have the same style of angle for the front ribs here as on the back. So on this Russian one, you can see they come over and then they have a very sharp angle where they go along, and then it's like they just angle down. It's a very consistent angle that they all go down, but it's a sharp angle. It's not at all tapered. Similar on the Bulgarian, although again it doesn't seem to be quite as cleanly done. They come along and then they have an angle down, but the Bulgarian also demonstrates a sharp angle, whereas the Poles kept with their tapered angle. So much like the front rib here, we have a consistent and gradual taper where it gets to about here and then it starts to taper down. So it's very rounded and much less sharp than the other two. And that brings us to the last subtle difference between them, and that would be the very back. So on the Russian here, we have that stamp, but also the delta between the bottom here and these reinforcings is fairly small, especially when compared to the Bulgarian, which has a much thicker section of exactly the same space. We have Russian and Bulgarian. As you can see, there's a lot thicker and it's a bit chunkier here in the back. The Polish grip is much more similar to the Russian in that it goes much further down, while the individual reinforcings in the middle here do seem to be a bit thicker than the Russian. So, Russian and Polish. One other subtle difference is the mold mark inside of the grip underneath the heat shield of the Bulgarian. It is actually a horizontal numbering instead of vertical like the Russian. Again, very subtle differences. If you pull one of these out of a box of parts, it would be certainly possible to identify where it came from. Pop quiz, which one is this? If you guessed Russian, congratulations, you've been paying attention and you get a red star. But it's not immediately abundantly clear, and it's very subtle design and contour differences and little tiny details that clue you in as to which one's which. So again, Russian, Bulgarian, and finally Polish. Now this is just the lower handguard. I also have representative samples of the upper handguards, but unfortunately with that there's less detail to be gained because there's really not a super great distinction between the Russian and the Bulgarian. So for the Russian one, it does seem as though stamps are fairly common, but that's not a very permanent feature that you can look for. The mold mark is in line with the length, but it's not distinctively different than the Bulgarian. I will say the Bulgarian is much shinier, but it also has a mold mark that is there in much the same place as the Russian. So not a whole lot of difference. Obviously there's a potential color difference, but I don't know how reliable that is. And then the stamp. So those two, honestly, it's kind of a toss-up. The Polish one, especially if it's a Tantal upper handguard, is super distinctive because it has this extra little nubbin that is to fit into the front sight block of the Tantal/barrel. It also has a front retainer spring here, but the black upper is distinctive in that it's not compatible with the normal gas tube, so it's super distinctive. One other thing about the Polish handguard is that there does appear to have been a version of the Polish handguard that had just a regular AKM style upper. This is the Bulgarian one, but I don't have one of those and I wasn't able to actually see inside of it or anything, so I have no clue how you would be able to distinguish that one from the Bulgarian or from the Russian. No idea. But apparently that did exist, so just because it doesn't have this little nubbin doesn't mean that it's not necessarily Polish, especially if it's paired with a Polish handguard. But it is a thing, and I just don't know enough about it to provide any additional details. With that, we have the Polish pairing with its very distinctive heat shield and retention springs. And then we have the Bulgarian with its chunkier palm swell. And lastly, we have the Russian with, in my opinion, slightly more refined injection molding. And it stamps, as well as this extra little bit there. Okay, cool. There we have entirely too much detail about AK handguards. So thank you for tuning in. I appreciate your time. Hopefully this was useful to you, and I'll see you next time. One thing about this Russian handguard is that it does not have a heat shield, and I have not been able to find a consistent reason as to why, but I have a random hypothesis that I'm gonna speculate wildly about. So I think this is a new production handguard that, yes, was made in Russia, but I think it was made for Russian civilian shotgun cells, because Russians have a weird law about, I think you have to own a shotgun for a couple of years before you're allowed to buy a rifle caliber. And so they have all these not rifles that are either cambered in like 410 or that weird 366, whatever it is, sort of like straight walled 7.62 by 39. That's like legally a shotgun because it's not rifled. It's only rifled halfway down the barrel or some nonsense. Regardless, it seems like this potentially was made for one of those. And I'm basing that off of Mocha's actually got a bunch of these in that look very similar and also do not have heat shields. And they have a sticker on the inside. And doing a little bit of Google foo there, it takes you back to a 410 Saiga that would make a bit more sense that they would cut a corner and not bother to put a heat shield into something that's really only meant to look like an AK, but it's obviously, if it's a 410 with a 10-round magazine, it's not as strictly necessary. I've not been able to find what appears to be a used Russian AK handguard that does not have a heat shield or does not at least have the cuts for a heat shield. There are certainly some that don't have a heat shield, but they're at least cut for it and the heat shield is just missing. This one was never even cut for a heat shield. As you can see down in there, it just does not have cuts on the inside for a heat shield. But I'm pretty confident in my presumption that this was made for like civilian commercial Russian production. And while it is Russian, it's still cool and I'm gonna use it. I think I'm gonna try to modify it for heat shield, but that will be a video for another day. Or if this video is at least a few weeks old, it'll probably be right somewhere there.